today, friends of mine, both gay and straight, still are relatively uneducated about the level of discrimination that the LGBT community still faces in terms of federal rights that just don't exist for gay couples. Of course, you know, where you can and you can't get married, and the list goes on. Are we missing the boat focusing on politics and not educating people? Do we need to blend education with politics? I mean, this is also one of the places where you step in, Carrie, now with the work you're doing with Equality Matters and getting the voice out into the public mainstream media.
One of our goals at Equality Matters, I think, is to sort of affect the way mainstream journalists report on LGBT issues and think about queer rights and how that comes across in the mainstream media, thereby moving the conversation forward nationwide. And you know, I think, I mean, just to look at the things that did happen, right? Don't Ask, Don't Tell got repealed. A lot of people have scratched their heads over ENDA. And like you say, the public isn't nearly as aware that in 29 states, lesbians and gays can still be fired without any legal recourse, and in 38 states, transgender folks can be fired without any legal recourse. So you ask the typical American that, they have no clue whatsoever. And I would say that there are a couple things, and I'll try to be really brief, but number one, there's been a narrative and there have been faces, including Dan Choi in the past 2 years especially, but there's been a narrative and faces to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. People remember when it was enacted. People remember that battle, and there was something for them to grab onto moving forward, and then there was continued reporting about the you know, discharge of special forces and people who had linguist capabilities like Dan, that was very powerful for people, that made people question, why are we doing this when it's actually not benefiting our military or our national security? There aren't those same high-profile stories for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and they, in some cases, are tough to find, not because they don't happen, but because if you are in a system where you have no legal recourse, then why are you going to try to step forward and prove in Mississippi, for instance, that you've been fired? I mean, what's the, for you know, on the basis of your sexual orientation or gender identity, what would that gain you? So the one other thing I would say is that in terms of the activist community, there was a very clear number of organizations and people who worked an outside game on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Dan and the work with Get Equal, that organization did a lot of direct actions, was one of them. Service Members Legal Defense Network also played both an inside and outside game, being in some of the rooms inside Washington and the White House, but also having protests and being very vocal in op-ed pages and things like that. They worked both an inside and an outside game. As I review what happened with ENDA, there was no outside game, and it made it very difficult to report on, and I think it didn't apply as much pressure on that particular piece of legislation. So I think that's one thing to take into account.
But when we talk about social movements, I agree, we do have to visualize, but there comes a turning point in every social movement as social movements follow a change theory that many corporations can relate to. When you talk about a turning point, that turning point for our social movement is when people, regular people, will be able to develop inside of them that somebodyness to fight back. I mean, you can't just say that legislatively by lobbying and not being public about the fight and not visualizing and sometimes having to put people through the ringer of activism. You can't just say that that's our goal and that's what's going to get us to even our legislative goal. I think standing up against an immoral policy and sacrificing is both an ends and a means. We can get our legislative equality, and I believe that we're going to get that within our lifetime. We're going to have all of those things passed, and we're going to be accepted. If any of you disagree with me, just go to a college and stop hanging out here. Go and see what our generation, those under 30, are saying. They have this hope. They know it's going to happen. But even if we do have the legislative victories, say within the next 10 years, there still is a missing element that's critical to all social movements. You see it in Egypt, you see it in Wisconsin, you see it all over the place where direct action is continuing to be used. These DREAM Act kids that were fighting for immigration equality. We were feeding off of each other, and we were developing this idea of somebodyness. And that's one thing that we cannot deny when you talk about what is most important towards getting that legislative equality. I think it is, you have to put that face I think it is, even after you get that legislative qual, you have to have people to stand up.
Well, the interesting thing is that when you think about politics, though, and you think about people and their identity, you know, keeping your personal stories personal and your personal life personal, and then the public face that you put forward, I mean, that just, there was a very distinct line there. You know, who you were as a politician, who you were in politics was very, very different from maybe who you were in the world. Are we talking about a world where that is no longer the case? Maybe are we going to see different kinds of politicians as well?
Not just politicians, but people in the media. I believe that there are a lot of gay journalists that try to separate, you know, their what they call my private life or what I do in the bed. And I think that demeans our identity as
that
a
is
culture.
really
I tried
personal.
to do that. I was not out at work, and it's been very difficult for me, a difficult line to walk.
Right, and well, I would never tell. I could never tell. With,
Well, there's that
one of those
website
stealth.
I was just looking.
But I believe that people like Anderson Cooper, when I had an interview with Anderson talking about being out professionally, talking about the profession that discriminated the most by the letter of the law, and having to explain to him that I have the courage to come out and get fired. There's a different paradigm shift happening. If we see people who are continuing to give the advice that I got from an 80-year-old band director when I was in high school who was closeted gay in Orange County, California. He thought that you could get a DUI and that'll disappear from your record. But you are gay, if you say it, you admit it, like it's a crime, you admit it, then it'll never disappear. And I took that advice for about 10 years while I was in the military. And I think it was the worst advice I could ever received. And I think anybody who dares give that advice in the corporate world to tell people that they should climb the ladder, or in the media world, because they say that you might have only certain kind of movie roles, or only certain kinds of journalistic enterprises that you might be able to go into. I think that's immoral. Right now, we have a paradigm that says it's a privacy issue, a privacy versus hypocrisy issue. If you're voting against our rights and that's hypocrisy, you don't deserve privacy. There's that privacy-hypocrisy paradigm. That's changing. I think nowadays we're seeing in our younger generations a morality paradigm where you say if you are in the corporate world and you're doing really well, you're closeted, but your sexual health and your emotional health and your family health and your community health is all based on those people who have come out, who started the gay bars that you frequent, who go and start .429 or start, you know, being out in the public and sacrificing, then you are not just being afraid and it's not just a matter of you don't have the courage yet. It's a matter of your immorality, that you are exploiting those who have sacrificed for you. And I think the younger generation gets that. The older generation cringes and they say, no, we lived through a very difficult time, but the bottom line is the younger generation should be listened to.
As long as we're talking really quickly about paradigm shifts and these really big picture concepts, I would say that we're starting to see, I feel like in the last, just 2 to 3 years, a real paradigm shift in terms of the polling, in terms of many different things, but where the burden of proof is shifting to people who discriminated against gays and lesbians having to justify, again, about why they are discriminating against the queer community in general, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals. It used to be that if you were part of the LGBT community, you had to justify why it was okay for you to be you. And I think we're just starting to see sort of a tipping point here where people are starting to say, wait a second, these people are tax-paying Americans, they participate in the community, they're just as moral as anybody else is in terms of the way they take care of their brothers and sisters and neighbors and kids. And it's starting to become a place where the people who are discriminating are having to justify why they're doing it. And as that happens, the shift that you're talking about will take place both with, in terms of politicians, in terms of the media, in terms of journalists, it will affect every profession across the board, both gay and straight.
I agree with you. I would say that how do you visualize, just like when these young kids in Prop 8 are visualizing, I don't know anything but equality, or I don't know anything but integrity, and I don't want anything but equality. They're out in the streets, and the reason why we had a march in 2009 fully funded, very little funding, but fully empowered and fueled by the grassroots kids, mostly under 30, who just don't know anything but to be out. And why a lot of the older generation were so inspired to see that, it was such a different visual from all of the other marches where you saw such a choreography. And when we're talking about doing another march in 2012 in May, I wonder what would happen because it was clear that there's a political paradigm that was happening with Prop 8 that angered a lot of people. I do believe that if we find something that angers us and the community, and if it starts at that youth level, and if it's powered and fueled at that level, you will see them coming out and calling for a march. And it won't really need a lot of the support or the sponsorship of any of the organizations. It will be bigger and better, and more people know how to do that.